want to return, though, to what's been the big focus, really, all week and for a long, long time, but particularly today on the back of Andrew Hastie's comments. Is Australia, is the West getting it right in how it's dealing with the rise of China and its ambitions in this region? Well, I'm joined now by Daniel Russel, who's a former US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. He, before that, was also a special assistant to the President in the Obama White House, and now a Vice President with the Asia Society Policy Institute. Daniel Russel, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. Appreciate your time. Look, you would have seen the comments, this piece from Andrew Hastie. Yes, he's a government backbencher, but the chair also of our Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. He's said, I'll read the quote, the French had failed to appreciate the evolution of mobile warfare in taking on Nazi Germany. Like the French, Australia has failed to see how mobile our authoritarian neighbour has become in reference to China. Do you think he's got a point?
Sure, but I also think, David, that there's a spectrum with naivete on one end, and at the other arc there is cynicism about China or even paranoia about China. And the key is getting it right. There should be a cold, an objective, cold look at the reality of China, and there should be prudent policies put in place to protect against predatory or dangerous behavior that adversely affects the national security or the economic interests of any country, including Australia. The key is to get the balance right, not to label China as an enemy, but not to overlook the very, very serious challenges presented by its behavior.
And do you think Australia is getting it right at the moment? We've done things like introduce a foreign influence set of laws. We've banned Huawei from involvement in the 5G rollout. But beyond that, we're very keen still on all that Chinese investment and trade.
That makes sense. Every government has the responsibility to try to maximize the benefits of trade, including with China, while at the same time trying to maximize the security and the protections against threats to an open society, to a democratic society. So I think Australia and the Australian government, as is true in many other countries, is contending with a complex mix of developments. This is a work in progress, and there's no one answer, there's no simple answer, and we should be very wary of sort of binary absolutist choices between good and bad, between security versus economy, between China versus the United States. Now, one thing that I vigorously agreed with in the opinion piece that you referenced is the point that Australia should be true to its values. And if Australian political leaders and if Australian business people remember who they are, what kind of nation this is, and that they want to live in, I think that they will have a reliable lodestone to navigate by.
Give me a bit of a sense of the attitude in Washington right now towards China. Is Donald Trump out on a frolic on his own in this trade war, or does he have cross-party establishment support for the tough line he's taking against China, at least when it comes to trade?
Great question, David. I think the key is to differentiate between attitudes on the diagnosis and attitudes about the remedy. In other words, there's a widespread consensus in government and politics, among think tanks, universities, and business, that China has exploited the openness of Western societies, has taken advantage of the system more broadly, and that enough is enough, that we really need to stop it. That said, I think there are great trepidations and a lot of reservations about the tactics that the Trump administration has pursued, in part because they've been so spectacularly ineffective. They've succeeded in alienating and angering the Chinese leadership, but they haven't succeeded in getting out.
Where is this heading? You don't see Beijing buckling at all?
Well, dictators have politics too. and China's Communist Party is rather boxed in some respects, because the sorts of things that the Trump administration is demanding and making public really run counter to the party's desire to maintain control. The U.S. approach has allowed this issue to evolve into one that really seems to be demanding surrender by China. And frankly, Xi Jinping, while an authoritarian leader, isn't strong enough to get away with making a deal that appears to be a surrender by China to the United States. So I think there are still tough times ahead. That said, the Chinese very much want an end to the pressure, the tariffs, and the uncertainty. And politics in the United States may bring Donald Trump to a point where he decides that it's time to fold his cards, take whatever deal he can, and then proclaim that this is the best deal ever made in history, as he often does.
You would have also seen the comments of the new US Defence Secretary, Mark Esper, the other day about having intermediate-range missiles based somewhere in the region, and a clarification from him yesterday that he's not talking about doing this anytime soon, that it's down the track. Nonetheless, this really upset China as well. What do you think about the prospects of a missile base for the United States somewhere in this region? Is it needed, and when do you think it might happen?
Well, I really don't know that the case for intermediate range missiles in Asia is terribly strong, but I certainly believe that it is, number one, hugely important for both the United States and Australia to steadily upgrade our defense cooperation, but importantly our defense installations, because China and the Chinese military is modernizing and expanding at an extraordinarily rapid pace. So we should be prudent. But the flip side of this, David, and maybe the more important proclamation was by the Chinese side, not by the new Secretary of Defense, in which they warned Australia not to do this. They asserted that this was unacceptable. Well, look, that is, number one, a direct interference into a sovereign decision by Australia. But more importantly, if China can induce the Australian public and the Australian government to flinch, to recoil, and to worry that economic retribution is something to be feared, and therefore legitimate security decisions should be reversed or not taken in order to keep China from getting angry, then I guarantee you, you are going to see a lot more threats from China in the future. If Australia is in fact true to its values, and China recognizes that Australia will take its own sovereign decisions based on cool-headed assessment of its interests, then I think you will see less of that kind of aggressive and threatening signaling from China.
I think that's a really interesting point, that China is very much looking for examples of indecisiveness, indecision on the part of Australia and others in the region. Can I just finally ask you, someone with a good understanding of this, we hear from China again in its response to Andrew Hastie's comments today that they are only about a peaceful rise. The growing prosperity, economic strength is all going to be very peaceful. What is China's long-term intent, do you think, in this region?
Yeah, well, China wants to maximize its advantage across a variety of fronts. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. But it's the responsibility of the nations in the region and their partners and allies to ensure that as China grows and as China expands its footprint in the region, it does so in a way that supports and not undermines the rule of law. It does so in a way that is consistent with global rules and norms. And to do that requires tempering, rhetoric on the one hand with a lack of understanding or even naivete on the other. Neither one of those is going to work. That said, David, I've been accused of hurting the feelings of 1.3 billion Chinese people many, many, many times in my career simply for speaking the truth. And the gap between China's grandiose rhetoric about peace and development and win-win solutions and its actual operation on the ground, its actual behaviors, whether it's in the South China Sea or whether it's in its own province of Xinjiang, the gap, the say-do gap, is so wide and frankly so worrisome that I think the days are gone when China can simply proclaim that it means well and therefore countries should stop pointing to problematic behavior and stop suspecting China, or at least putting the onus on China to show that its intentions are honorable.